A prayer in the cold. The evening service had ended, and the church's grand stained glass windows cast dim, colorful reflections on the snow-covered ground. Pastor Daniel Harper took a deep breath, the cold air stinging his lungs as he stood at the doorway of St. Matthew's Church. He had just finished his final rounds, ensuring that everything was in order before he locked up for the night. The wind howled softly through the empty streets, carrying with it the crisp scent of winter. He was about to turn and head inside when something caught his eye. A small figure huddled near the church steps, barely visible under the glow of a flickering street lamp. At first, he thought it was just another shadow cast by the light, but then he saw movement, a slight trembling, a shift of the frail frame against the bitter wind. His heart clenched. A child. Pastor Daniel squinted against the dim light, stepping closer. As he approached, the figure became clearer. A young girl, no older than 12, kneeling in the snow. Her head was bowed, hands clasped together in silent prayer. Her clothes were far too thin for the brutal cold, a tattered hoodie draped over her small shoulders, and shoes worn down to the soles. Snowflakes had settled in her curly black hair, untouched by the girl who remained utterly still, lost in whispered supplication. Pastor Daniel's breath caught in his throat. She was praying, not crying, not begging, just praying. The sight shook him. The bitter wind howled around them, but she did not move. He saw her lips quiver, mouthing words he couldn't quite hear. "Child," he called softly, not wanting to startle her. She did not react. Her frame trembled under the weight of the cold, but still, she prayed. Pastor Daniel stepped closer, his boots crunching against the snow. "Sweetheart, it's freezing out here. You shouldn't be alone in this cold." She still didn't answer. Pastor Daniel knelt beside her, the ice biting through his trousers, but he ignored it. He was close enough now to see the tear tracks on her cheeks, glistening like frozen rivers in the dim light. His heart ached. "Tasha," he whispered. At the mention of her name, the girl's eyes flickered open for a brief moment, locking with his. There was something haunting about those dark eyes, something old, something weary. They carried a heaviness that no child should ever have to bear. But just as quickly as she had looked at him, she averted her gaze, staring down at her clasped hands. She had hurt him. "You know me, don't you?" he asked gently. "I've seen you around town." Still, she didn't answer. Pastor Daniel let out a slow breath, his heart squeezing in his chest. He had seen her before, always alone, always wandering the town streets like a ghost. Some days she sat outside the small grocery store, watching people come and go, never asking for anything. Other times, he had noticed her at the bus station, curled up on a bench with nothing but a backpack clutched tightly to her chest. No parents, no home, just a lost child in a world that had turned its back on her. "Tasha," he tried again, his voice softer now. "I'm Pastor Daniel. I want to help you." The girl flinched, ever so slightly. "Please," he urged, "come inside. It's warm." For the first time, her lips stopped moving. The silent prayer ceased. She hesitated, her fingers tightening around each other. Pastor Daniel noticed. It was the smallest reaction, but it was something. He stood slowly, reaching out his hand. "Come inside with me, just for a little while." She didn't move. The wind howled around them, and Pastor Daniel fought back the growing dread in his chest. What if she refused? What if she ran? What if he left her here, and she? He swallowed hard, forcing the thought away. "Please," he whispered. Tasha's small fingers twitched, as if debating whether or not to take his hand. She bit her lip, her shoulders rising and falling with a deep breath. Then, finally, with a hesitance that nearly broke him, she gave a small nod and slipped her icy hand into his. It was so cold. Pastor Daniel felt his throat tighten as he wrapped his own warm hand around hers. "Come on," he said gently. "Let's get you out of the cold." The warmth of the church wrapped around them like a protective cocoon as they stepped inside. The scent of old wood, candle wax, and aged hymnals filled the air. The dim glow from the altar candles cast flickering shadows along the high stone walls, giving the sanctuary a soft, welcoming glow. Pastor Daniel guided her to a pew near the front, his mind racing. He had never encountered a situation quite like this before. Homelessness was not uncommon in their town, but a child, alone, in the dead of winter. He had so many questions. But first, warmth. "Wait here," he said gently, heading toward his office. Tasha said nothing, only sat motionless, her hands folded in her lap, as if she were still praying. Pastor Daniel returned quickly with a thick wool blanket and a brown paper bag. He draped the blanket around her shoulders, relieved when she didn't resist. "This should help warm you up," he said, sitting beside her. She clutched the edges of the blanket, pulling it tighter around herself. Pastor Daniel reached into the paper bag and pulled out a sandwich and an apple. "I know it's not much, but please, eat." Tasha hesitated. Then, slowly, she reached out with trembling hands, taking the sandwich as if it were something sacred. She took a small bite, chewed, swallowed, and then another, and another. Pastor Daniel swallowed against the lump in his throat. When was the last time she had eaten? When she was about halfway through the sandwich, he spoke again. "Tasha, can you tell me why you were out there alone?" She stopped chewing, her fingers tightening around the bread. Pastor Daniel waited, patient. After a long moment, her voice came, so soft it was nearly lost in the silence. We lost our home." His chest ached. "My dad, he lost his job," she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "Then Mom got sick. We couldn't pay rent. We had to leave." Pastor Daniel's fingers curled into a fist. "And your parents?" he asked gently. Tasha's lip trembled. "Dad left." A single tear slipped down her cheek. "Mom," her voice cracked, and she looked down at her lap. "She's in the hospital." Pastor Daniel inhaled sharply. "Do you know where?" he asked carefully. She shook her head. "I don't know. They took her away in an ambulance. I never saw her again." Pastor Daniel felt a deep sorrow settle in his chest. "How long have you been alone?" he asked, though he dreaded the answer. Tasha bit her lip. "Months. Months." Pastor Daniel closed his eyes, overwhelmed by the weight of her words. He had to help her. He would help her. "I pray for her every night," Tasha whispered. Pastor Daniel opened his eyes. "For your mother?" he asked. Tasha nodded. "And for my dad to come back. And for everyone else. The ones out there in the cold." Pastor Daniel felt his throat tighten. Even now, with nothing to her name, she prayed for others. His heart broke. "Tasha," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion, "you won't be alone anymore." For the first time since he had found her, Tasha looked up, her dark eyes searching his. "Promise?" she asked. Pastor Daniel reached out, gently squeezing her small hand. "I promise." The weight of a promise. The silence inside the church felt sacred. The warmth of the sanctuary wrapped around them like a gentle embrace, a stark contrast to the biting cold just outside its doors. Pastor Daniel sat in the pew beside Tasha, the quiet between them filled with unspoken thoughts. The glow from the altar candles flickered, casting soft shadows along the stone walls, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, the little girl beside him seemed at peace. But Pastor Daniel wasn't. His mind swirled with questions, doubts, and an overwhelming sense of responsibility. He had made a promise to Tasha, a promise that she wouldn't be alone anymore. But what did that really mean? How could he, a simple pastor with limited resources, change the life of a child who had already been through so much? He had no idea where to even begin. The weight of his words settled heavily on his chest. Still, looking at her now, bundled in the thick wool blanket he had given her, her tiny hands clutching the edges as if afraid it might disappear. He knew one thing for certain. He couldn't let her go back out into that cold. Not tonight. Not ever. Pastor Daniel exhaled, running a hand through his graying hair before turning to the child beside him. "Tasha," he said gently, "would you like to rest here for a little while? The church is warm, and you're safe here." The girl hesitated for only a moment before nodding. She looked exhausted, her small frame weary from more than just a lack of sleep. This was the exhaustion of someone who had been carrying burdens too heavy for her young shoulders. Pastor Daniel stood. "Come on," he said softly, offering his hand again. "There's a room in the back where you can lie down. It's not much, but it's warm." Tasha hesitated again, then, with a small nod, placed her tiny hand in his. He led her through the dimly lit corridors of the church, past the empty pews, and the pulpit where he had spoken so many sermons about compassion, about helping those in need. And yet now that he was faced with a real urgent need, a child without a home, he realized how utterly unprepared he was. They reached a small room tucked away near his office. It wasn't much, just a modest space with a wooden cot, a shelf lined with old hymnals, and a few extra blankets stored for winter relief efforts. He had used it before for traveling missionaries who needed a place to rest, but tonight it would serve a far greater purpose. Tasha stepped inside cautiously, as though unsure if she was truly welcome. "It's yours for the night," Pastor Daniel reassured her. "Make yourself comfortable." She nodded again but said nothing. He retrieved another thick blanket from the shelf, laying it over the cot before stepping back to give her space. "If you need anything, I'll be right outside. Okay?" Tasha hesitated before looking up at him. "Thank you, Pastor Daniel," she whispered. The words were so soft, so fragile, that he felt them more than he heard them. "You're welcome, sweetheart." With that, he stepped out of the room, closing the door just enough to give her privacy, but leaving it slightly open in case she needed him. For a long moment, Pastor Daniel stood there, staring at the wooden door, the weight of everything pressing down on him. He was responsible for this child now. But what could he do? A heavy heart. Sleep did not come easily that night. Pastor Daniel sat in his office, his Bible open before him, though he had barely glanced at the pages. His thoughts were restless. He had spent years ministering to people in need, but Tasha's situation was different. This wasn't just a church member struggling with finances or a grieving widow in need of comfort. This was a child. Alone. Abandoned. And she had no one else. Pastor Daniel let out a long breath, rubbing his temples as he leaned back in his chair. He needed help. He couldn't do this alone. His mind raced through a list of names, people in the congregation who might be able to assist. Margaret, the head of the church's outreach program, had always been passionate about charity work. Mrs. Johnson, though elderly, was known for opening her home to those in need. The Wilsons, a young couple who had recently joined the church, had fostered children before. Maybe, just maybe, someone would step up. Without hesitating, he picked up the phone and dialed the first number on his list. "Hello," Margaret's voice answered, groggy from sleep. "Margaret, it's Pastor Daniel. I'm so sorry to call this late, but I need your help." A harsh reality. The next morning, Tasha woke to the scent of something warm. She sat up slowly, rubbing her tired eyes, as the morning light filtered through the small window of the church room. For a brief, blissful moment, she forgot where she was. Then reality set in. She wasn't home. Her mother wasn't there. The cold hadn't been a dream. But there was something different this morning. The air smelled of food. Tentatively, she slid out of bed, wrapping the blanket around her shoulders as she stepped out into the hall. Pastor Daniel stood in the small kitchen attached to the church's community hall, pouring a steaming cup of tea. On the table, a plate of scrambled eggs and toast sat waiting. Tasha hesitated in the doorway. Pastor Daniel turned, smiling warmly. "Good morning, Tasha. I hope you're hungry." She was. But she was also hesitant. "Is this for me?" she asked quietly. Pastor Daniel's heart ached at the question. "Of course, sweetheart. Come sit." Tasha slowly approached the table, sliding into the chair cautiously. The warmth of the teacup between her fingers sent a pleasant shiver down her spine. "Did you sleep okay?" Pastor Daniel asked gently. She nodded, taking a small sip of the tea. As she ate in silence, Pastor Daniel watched her carefully. Every bite was slow, deliberate, as if she were savoring something she wasn't sure she would ever have again. He needed to do more. "Tasha," he said softly, "I spoke with someone last night, a woman from our church who helps people in need. She wants to meet you. Maybe she can help." Tasha stiffened slightly but didn't look up. Pastor Daniel continued, choosing his words carefully. "She's a good person, I promise. We're going to figure something out." For the first time that morning, Tasha met his gaze. "Figure what out?" she asked. Pastor Daniel exhaled. "How to help you, Tasha. How to get you back to your mother." Tasha's lower lip trembled. "Really? I promise," Pastor Daniel said again, his voice firm. Tasha said nothing, but the way her shoulders relaxed ever so slightly told him everything. She wanted to believe him, and Pastor Daniel was determined not to let her down. That afternoon, Margaret arrived at the church. She was a woman in her 60s with kind eyes and a warm demeanor, known for organizing food drives and helping struggling families. She listened intently as Pastor Daniel explained everything. When she finally met Tasha, the older woman's face softened with immediate understanding. "Oh, sweetheart," she murmured, kneeling beside the girl. "You've been through so much." Tasha, hesitant but drawn to Margaret's warmth, nodded. Margaret turned to Pastor Daniel. "We need to find her mother," she said firmly. "And fast." Pastor Daniel nodded. It was time to make good on his promise. Tasha wouldn't be alone anymore. Not if he had anything to do with it. A town's secrets and a mother's fate. The following morning, St. Matthew's Church was unusually quiet. Pastor Daniel sat in his office, his hands clasped in prayer, searching for guidance. Last night had been the first time Tasha had slept under a real roof in months, and though she had barely spoken, her eyes told him everything. She was exhausted, lost, but somewhere beneath the fear and pain there was a glimmer of hope. He had made her a promise. But how was he going to keep it? Finding Tasha's mother was proving to be a greater challenge than he had anticipated. Hospitals wouldn't release patient information without authorization, and the only lead they had was that an ambulance had taken her somewhere. Somewhere wasn't good enough. Pastor Daniel rubbed his tired eyes and exhaled deeply. He had spent half the night making calls, trying to pull favors from old friends, but all he had was dead ends. He needed help. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. "Come in," he called. The door opened slowly, and Margaret stepped inside, carrying a stack of papers. Her usual kind eyes were clouded with worry. "I've been making some calls," she said, setting the papers down on his desk. "I reached out to a friend who works at the social services office, but there's no official record of Tasha in their system. No foster placement, no caseworker assigned." Pastor Daniel's stomach turned. How is that possible? A child living on the streets for months should have raised some kind of flag. Margaret shook her head. "That's what I thought too. But it gets stranger. When I checked the hospital system, I couldn't find a single record of her mother, Teresa Winston, being admitted in any of the local facilities." Pastor Daniel sat up straight. "That's not possible. The ambulance took her. Someone must have documented it." Margaret hesitated, then reached for a smaller paper at the bottom of the pile. "There's one more thing." She handed him a printout. "I dug deeper and found this." Pastor Daniel took the paper and scanned the lines of text. His breath caught in his throat. A police report. The name on it, Teresa Winston. His eyes darted to the date. It was from 3 months ago. The report stated that an ambulance had indeed picked up Teresa Winston outside a shelter after she collapsed. But instead of taking her to a hospital, she had been transferred to a state-run facility for the mentally ill. "Why?" Pastor Daniel murmured, his fingers gripping the edges of the paper. "Why would they send her there instead of a hospital?" Margaret's lips pressed into a thin line. "Because someone filed a report claiming she was a danger to herself and others." Pastor Daniel's heart pounded. "Who?" Margaret hesitated before answering. "Her husband." A stunned silence filled the room. "Tasha's father." Pastor Daniel's chest tightened. He had assumed the man had abandoned his family, but now, for the first time, there was another layer to the story. A much darker one. He looked at Margaret, his voice a mixture of disbelief and anger. "He had her committed." Margaret nodded. "That's what it looks like." Pastor Daniel leaned back, trying to steady his thoughts. "Then that means," Margaret finished his sentence, "that she may not be sick at all." A shiver ran down Pastor Daniel's spine. He had seen situations like this before, cases where vulnerable people, especially women, were manipulated, silenced, and cast aside by the very systems meant to protect them. If Teresa had been wrongly institutionalized, she might have spent the last 3 months trapped in a place she didn't belong. And all this time, her daughter had been alone, praying for a mother who never abandoned her, but had been stolen from her. Pastor Daniel's jaw clenched. He wasn't going to let this stand. Confronting the past, Tasha sat quietly in the church's small kitchen, her hands wrapped around a warm cup of tea. She had been silent most of the morning, watching the few volunteers bustle around. Pastor Daniel approached slowly, unsure of how to tell her what he had learned. She deserved the truth. But how could he tell a child that her father, the man she had prayed would return, had been the one to take her mother away? "Tasha," he said gently, sitting across from her. "We found something." The girl's fingers tensed around her cup. "About Mama?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Pastor Daniel nodded. "We found a report. An ambulance did take her, but not to a hospital." Tasha's eyes darkened. "Then where?" He hesitated. "She was taken to a special facility. They said she was sick." Tasha's breath hitched. "But she wasn't," she whispered. "Mama wasn't sick." Pastor Daniel reached across the table, placing his hand gently over hers. "I believe you, sweetheart. And I think we need to find out the truth." Tasha's gaze dropped to the table, her small fingers tightening into fists. "I prayed," she whispered. "I prayed so hard that she would get better, that she would come back." Pastor Daniel's chest ached. "I know you did, Tasha. And now we're going to bring her home." Tasha's eyes lifted, cautious but hopeful. "How?" Pastor Daniel inhaled deeply. "We start by asking the right questions. A town's secrets." That afternoon, Pastor Daniel drove to the town's administrative offices. He was no stranger to bureaucracy, but today he had no patience for it. He was directed to a caseworker named David Reynolds, a man in his 50s with a thinning hairline and a desk piled high with folders. Pastor Daniel wasted no time. "I need information on Teresa Winston." Reynolds sighed, already looking exasperated. "Sir, I can't give out private." Pastor Daniel slammed the police report on the desk. "This is a mistake, and you know it." Reynolds frowned, his fingers tapping the paper. "Where did you get this?" "That doesn't matter," Pastor Daniel said firmly. "What matters is that a woman was taken against her will, and I intend to find out why." Reynolds hesitated, his expression shifting. He knew something. "There was a complaint," Reynolds admitted, lowering his voice. "A man named Gregory Winston filed it. He claimed his wife was a danger to their daughter." Pastor Daniel's blood ran cold. Gregory Winston had used Tasha's name to justify locking up her mother. "Where is he now?" Pastor Daniel asked. Reynolds shook his head. "Gone. Vanished. He cleared out his accounts, left the state. Coward." Pastor Daniel's hands curled into fists. This wasn't just a case of abandonment. This was calculated cruelty. Gregory had trapped Teresa, abandoned his daughter, and disappeared without a trace. and now it was up to him to fix it. Reynolds sighed, rubbing his temples. I shouldn't be telling you this, but he slid a small piece of paper across the desk. This is where she is. Pastor Daniel's heart pounded as he read the name. Rosewood State Psychiatric Hospital. His gaze snapped up. Can I visit her? Reynolds hesitated, then nodded. But be careful, Pastor. Some places don't let people go so easily. Pastor Daniel didn't flinch. He had already made up his mind. He was getting Teresa Winston out, and he was bringing Tasha's mother home. Behind locked doors. The drive to Rosewood State Psychiatric Hospital was long and unnervingly quiet. Pastor Daniel gripped the steering wheel, his mind racing with thoughts about what lay ahead. The place itself had an ominous reputation. Whispers of mistreatment, patients forgotten by their families, and a bureaucracy so thick it was nearly impossible to navigate. He wasn't just walking into a hospital. He was walking into a fortress. Sitting in the passenger seat, Tasha remained silent, staring out the window as the blurred landscape rolled past. She had barely spoken since they left the church, but Pastor Daniel could feel the tension radiating from her small frame. She was nervous. So was he. Tasha, he said gently. She turned toward him, her eyes dark and cautious. No matter what happens today, I need you to remember something, he continued, keeping his voice steady. Your mother loves you. No one, not this hospital, not the people who put her there, can take that away. Tasha nodded, but the shadows in her eyes didn't fade. The road narrowed as they approached the facility. Rosewood wasn't a traditional hospital. It was a massive, gray-bricked institution, surrounded by high iron gates and barbed wire, as if its purpose wasn't just to treat patients but to keep them in. Pastor Daniel felt a deep unease settle in his chest. Something wasn't right. Crossing the threshold, a stoic-looking security guard met them at the front entrance, eyeing them with mild suspicion. Can I help you? The man asked, his voice gruff. I'm here to visit a patient, Teresa Winston, Pastor Daniel said, forcing himself to remain calm. The guard's face twitched, a flicker of recognition that made Pastor Daniel's stomach tighten. There are rules for visits, the guard said slowly. You'll need clearance. Pastor Daniel squared his shoulders. Then let me speak with whoever's in charge. The guard hesitated, then motioned for them to follow. Inside, the hospital was cold, not in temperature, but in feeling. The walls were pale and featureless, the air heavy with antiseptic and something else, a stillness that set his nerves on edge. This wasn't a place for healing. It was a place where people were forgotten. A nurse at the front desk barely glanced at them as she shuffled through paperwork. Name of the patient? She asked, bored. Teresa Winston. That got her attention. Her eyes flicked up, studying them carefully before she forced a neutral expression. One moment. She disappeared through a side door, leaving them standing awkwardly in the cold hallway. Tasha shifted beside him, her small hands clenched into fists. Minutes stretched into what felt like an eternity. Then the nurse returned, followed by a tall, severe-looking woman in a white coat. Her ID badge read, Dr. Miriam Caldwell, Chief Administrator. Pastor Daniel's stomach sank. He had dealt with people like her before, the kind who had too much power and were far too comfortable playing God. Pastor Daniel, she greeted, her voice polite but distant. I understand you've come to inquire about one of our patients. Yes, he said evenly. Teresa Winston. I'd like to see her. Dr. Caldwell smiled, the kind of smile that wasn't really a smile at all. I'm afraid that won't be possible. Pastor Daniel's jaw tightened. And why is that? She's not in a condition to receive visitors, Dr. Caldwell said smoothly. Her treatment is ongoing, and visits from outsiders could disrupt her progress. Pastor Daniel didn't believe her for a second. He had seen this tactic before, stonewalling, keeping people at arm's length until they gave up. But he wasn't leaving without answers. With all due respect, Doctor, he said, keeping his voice firm, her daughter has been alone for months. She has a right to see her mother. Tasha, who had remained silent, finally spoke. "Please," she whispered. "I just want to see her." For the briefest moment, Dr. Caldwell's expression cracked, as if something human still remained beneath the polished, professional exterior. But just as quickly, the mask was back. "I'm sorry," she said coolly. "That won't be possible." The lie. Pastor Daniel knew when he was being lied to. He had spent years counseling people, learning the tells that revealed the truth behind their words. And right now, Dr. Caldwell was lying. But why? There were only two possibilities. Teresa truly was sick, too unstable to function, just as the reports claimed. She wasn't sick at all, and they were keeping her here for another reason. Pastor Daniel's instincts screamed that it was the latter. He took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. "Dr. Caldwell," he said, "I've read the report on Teresa's case. I know her husband filed the commitment request." Something flashed in the doctor's eyes, gone in an instant. "She was placed here under legal authority," Caldwell said dismissively. "It's out of my hands." That was another lie. She had power here, and she knew it. Pastor Daniel felt anger simmering beneath his skin, not for himself, but for the woman who had been trapped here, and the child standing beside him, hoping for a miracle. "If she's truly unwell," he said carefully, "then let me see for myself." Dr. Caldwell's expression darkened. "I'm sorry, but that's against policy." Pastor Daniel narrowed his eyes. They were hiding something, and if he couldn't go through the front door, then he would find another way. A plan in motion. That evening, back at the church, Pastor Daniel gathered the small group of trusted allies who had already helped him. Margaret, the Wilsons, Mrs. Johnson, and one more unexpected ally, David Reynolds, the caseworker from social services. "I did some digging," Reynolds admitted, glancing around at the group. "You were right. The paperwork on Teresa's case is a mess. There's no medical evaluation from a licensed psychiatrist. She was sent to Rosewood on nothing more than her husband's word." Pastor Daniel's stomach twisted. "How do we get her out?" Margaret asked, her voice tight with determination. "That's where it gets tricky," Reynolds admitted. "Once someone's in the system, it's hard to pull them out. If we want her released, we need evidence." "Evidence of what?" Mrs. Johnson asked. "Neglect, abuse, anything that proves she's being held there unfairly." Pastor Daniel's mind raced. Dr. Caldwell was hiding something, and he was going to find out what it was. Breaking the silence. 2 days later, Pastor Daniel found himself back at Rosewood, this time not as a visitor, but as a man on a mission. He had one goal: to get inside, to find Teresa. And the moment he stepped into the waiting area, he spotted a nurse on break, smoking just outside the staff entrance. An idea sparked in his mind. He approached her slowly, offering a warm smile. "Excuse me, miss." The nurse turned, wary. "I'm here about Teresa Winston," he said gently. "I know she's here, but no one will let me see her." The nurse hesitated. Something in her expression shifted. "She shouldn't be here," she whispered. "She doesn't belong here." Pastor Daniel's heart pounded. "Then help me." The nurse looked around, checking to make sure no one was listening. Then she took a deep breath. "There's something you need to know," she whispered. "Something they don't want you to find out." Pastor Daniel leaned in. "What is it?" The nurse swallowed hard. "She's not sick." Pastor Daniel felt his breath catch. "She's been trying to tell them for months," the nurse continued. "But no one listens. They keep her locked away, sedated, to keep her quiet." A cold dread settled in Pastor Daniel's chest. Teresa wasn't just wrongfully committed. She was being silenced. And if they didn't act fast, they might lose her forever. The truth behind locked doors. Pastor Daniel's breath caught in his throat. The nurse's words hit him like a thunderclap. "She's not sick. They're keeping her quiet." The weight of those words pressed down on him, igniting a deep anger in his chest. He had suspected something was wrong, but hearing it confirmed made his blood boil. This wasn't just an administrative mistake or a case of misplaced paperwork. This was intentional. Teresa had been silenced, and if no one had intervened yet, then that meant someone wanted her to stay that way. The nurse glanced nervously over her shoulder before taking another drag of her cigarette, exhaling shakily. "Look, I don't know what you plan to do with this information," she muttered, her voice barely above a whisper. "But if they find out I told you—" "They won't," Pastor Daniel assured her quickly. "But please, if there's anything else you can tell me, anything that can help get her out, you have to tell me now." The nurse hesitated, her fingers tightening around the cigarette. Then she lowered her voice. "She's in the restricted wing." Pastor Daniel's stomach twisted. The restricted wing. That was never a good sign. "They keep her heavily sedated most days," the nurse continued. "But some days, she fights it. She begs for someone to listen. Says she has a daughter waiting for her." The nurse swallowed hard. "We're supposed to ignore it. They tell us it's just the delusions talking." But she shook her head. "She's not delusional, Pastor. She's desperate." Pastor Daniel clenched his fists. "Then I need to see her." The nurse let out a dry, humorless laugh. "Good luck. No one gets into that wing unless they have authorization from Dr. Caldwell." Pastor Daniel felt his frustration spike. "What about you? Can you get me inside?" The nurse hesitated again, biting her lip. "Even if I could, if they catch me helping you, I'd lose my job." Pastor Daniel took a deep breath. He understood the risk she was taking. He couldn't ask her to do that. But he also couldn't walk away. "Then tell me another way in," he pressed. The nurse hesitated for a long moment before finally speaking. "There's a side entrance, for staff only," she murmured. "You'll need a badge to get through." Pastor Daniel's heart pounded. "Can you get me one?" The nurse let out a slow exhale. "I can try," she said, "but it might take a day or two." Pastor Daniel nodded. "That's all I need." The nurse flicked away her cigarette and gave him a long, measured look. "I hope you know what you're doing, Pastor." He didn't, but he knew he had to do it anyway. A dangerous plan. When Pastor Daniel returned to the car, Tasha was waiting for him, gripping the edge of the seat as if holding on for dear life. Her small fingers clenched the fabric of her coat, her dark eyes searching his face the moment he opened the door. "Did you see her?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Pastor Daniel sighed heavily, resting his hands on the steering wheel. "No," he admitted. "Not yet." Tasha swallowed hard. "But she's here." "Yes," he said, "and I'm going to get her out." Tasha blinked up at him, her gaze unreadable. "How?" Pastor Daniel hesitated. He couldn't tell her the full truth. "Not yet." He forced a smile, trying to sound reassuring. "I'm working on that, sweetheart." She didn't look convinced. Tasha was too smart for that. Still, she nodded, pressing her lips together. "I want to help." Pastor Daniel's chest tightened. He reached over, gently squeezing her hand. "You are helping, Tasha. More than you know." Her fingers curled around his, holding on tight. For the first time, Pastor Daniel saw something new in her eyes. Not just hope. Determination. She believed in him. Now he had to make sure he didn't fail her. Into the lion's den. The next 2 days were some of the longest of Pastor Daniel's life. He made calls, pulling every string he could. He reached out to David Reynolds, the social worker, pushing for a formal review of Teresa's case. He pleaded with Margaret and a few other church members to gather witness statements. Anything that might help. But bureaucratic wheels turned slowly, and Teresa didn't have time. Then, on the second evening, he got a call. It was the nurse. "I have a badge," she whispered. Pastor Daniel's pulse skyrocketed. "When can I get it?" "Tonight," she said. "But you only have one shot at this, Pastor, if you get caught." Pastor Daniel didn't need her to finish that sentence. He knew exactly what was at stake. The break-in. That night, under the cover of darkness, Pastor Daniel drove back to Rosewood. He parked down the street, out of view of the hospital's security cameras. His heart pounded as he stepped out into the cold, the nurse's words replaying in his head. "You only have one shot at this." The hospital loomed ahead, its gray walls standing tall and menacing against the night sky. It felt less like a place of healing and more like a prison. He approached the side entrance, just as the nurse had instructed. There, tucked between two dumpsters, she was waiting. She looked over her shoulder, her face tight with anxiety. "Here," she whispered, pressing the stolen badge into his hand. Pastor Daniel gripped it tightly. "Thank you." She hesitated, glancing toward the building. "If they catch you." "They won't," he said firmly, though his hands were shaking. The nurse swallowed hard, then nodded. "Go." With that, she disappeared into the night. Pastor Daniel turned to the door, swiped the badge. A soft click. The door unlocked. He pushed it open and stepped inside. Inside Rosewood. The moment Pastor Daniel entered the facility, a wave of unease hit him like a wall. The hallways were eerily quiet, the air thick with the scent of antiseptic and something darker, something wrong. He moved cautiously, keeping to the shadows. The restricted wing was down a separate hallway, past a guard station. He would have to move fast. His pulse thundered as he walked, forcing himself to remain calm, to blend in. He wore a plain black coat, neutral enough to pass as a staff member if no one looked too closely. His footsteps echoed. Then, a voice. "Hey, who are you?" Pastor Daniel's stomach plummeted. A guard. For one breathless second, he froze. Then he acted. "Dr. Caldwell sent me," he lied smoothly. "Patient review." The guard frowned, eyeing him warily. Pastor Daniel held his breath. Then, miraculously, the guard nodded. "Third door on the left," he muttered. "She's sedated." Pastor Daniel didn't hesitate. He walked. One step, then another. Each step took him closer. To Teresa. To the truth. And to whatever was waiting for him behind that door. The door to the truth. Pastor Daniel's heart pounded against his ribs as he approached the third door on the left. The hallway stretched long and sterile, the kind of place designed to feel impersonal, to strip people of their identity, their humanity. His breath felt shallow, each step measured, each movement precise. He knew he was walking a thin line. One wrong step, and he'd be caught, thrown out, or worse. But he couldn't stop now. Not when he was so close to finding Teresa. He reached the door. A small nameplate beside it read, "Winston, Teresa. Patient #2495. A surge of relief flooded him. She was here. But as he reached for the handle, another realization dawned. If she was here, why had Dr. Caldwell been so determined to keep him away? A cold chill ran through him. There was something they didn't want him to see. His fingers trembled as he gripped the door handle. He turned it and stepped inside. The woman in the bed. The room was dimly lit, a single fluorescent bulb casting harsh shadows along the gray walls. A narrow hospital bed sat against the far wall, covered in thin white sheets. And in the bed was a woman, Teresa Winston, or what was left of her. Pastor Daniel sucked in a sharp breath. She was frail, alarmingly so. Her skin was pale, almost ghostly, and her cheeks were hollowed, as if the life had been drained from her over time. Thick restraints bound her wrists and ankles to the bed, and her once vibrant brown eyes were glazed over, unfocused. But it wasn't illness that had done this to her. It was the drugs. The realization made Pastor Daniel's stomach turn. Teresa Winston wasn't just here. She was being kept here. His hands clenched into fists. Who had done this to her? How long had she been locked in this half-life, her body existing, but her mind numbed into submission? A sudden rush of rage burned in his chest. This was evil, and it had to end. Pastor Daniel stepped forward, kneeling beside the bed. He reached out carefully, his hand hovering over hers before he gently touched her wrist. "Teresa," he whispered. No response. His throat tightened. "Teresa, it's me, Pastor Daniel. Do you remember me?" A flicker. A tiny, almost imperceptible twitch in her fingers. Pastor Daniel's heart leaped. She was in there, buried beneath the sedation, beneath the forced compliance. Teresa Winston was still fighting. He just had to bring her back. Carefully, he pressed his other hand over hers, squeezing gently. "Teresa, listen to me. You have a daughter, Tasha. She's waiting for you. She's been praying for you." Her lips parted slightly, and her breath hitched. Another flicker. Tasha's name had reached her. Pastor Daniel leaned in closer. "She never stopped believing in you, Teresa. She's been out there alone, waiting for you to come back." A tear slid down Teresa's cheek. A whisper. So soft, he almost missed it. "Tasha." Pastor Daniel's chest ached. "She needs you," he said urgently. "But we have to get you out of here." Teresa's eyelids fluttered, as if she was trying to fight through the fog in her mind. Her fingers twitched, curling slightly against his. It was the smallest movement, but it was enough. She was waking up, and Pastor Daniel knew exactly what he had to do. The escape plan. Pastor Daniel didn't waste another second. He needed to get Teresa out of here. Now. He scanned the room. A clipboard hung at the foot of her bed, detailing her treatment schedule. Heavy doses of antipsychotics and sedatives, none of which should have been given without proper evaluation. They had been drugging her into submission. Pastor Daniel's jaw tightened. He yanked the clipboard off the hook, flipping through the pages until he found it. The authorization forms. His eyes widened. The signature on the documents wasn't from a doctor. It was from Gregory Winston, Tasha's father. The man who had abandoned his own daughter had also signed away his wife's freedom. Pastor Daniel's hands shook with anger. This was premeditated, calculated. Gregory Winston had wanted his wife out of the way, permanently, and Rosewood had helped him do it. Pastor Daniel exhaled sharply, forcing himself to focus. He didn't have time for rage. He needed to act. He ripped the forms off the clipboard and shoved them into his coat. If he could get them to David Reynolds, the caseworker, they'd have proof that Teresa's commitment was unlawful. Then he turned his attention back to her. She was awake now, barely, her lips moving soundlessly. He leaned in close. "Teresa," he whispered, "can you walk?" Her gaze focused on him for the first time. She blinked slowly. Then, with a great effort, she nodded. Pastor Daniel felt a surge of hope. He unfastened the restraints. Gently, he helped her sit up. She swayed, her body weak from months of forced sedation, but she wasn't giving up. With one arm around her waist, he helped her to her feet. She trembled, but she stood. And in that moment, Pastor Daniel knew. They were getting out of here. The alarms. The second he stepped into the hallway with Teresa, everything went wrong. A voice shouted behind them. "Hey, what are you doing?" Pastor Daniel spun around. A security guard. His pulse skyrocketed. For a split second, he froze. Then, he ran. He pulled Teresa with him, moving as fast as her weakened body would allow. Footsteps thundered behind them. A loud blaring alarm filled the hallways. They had been caught. Pastor Daniel's adrenaline surged. "Come on, Teresa," he urged, gripping her tighter. She stumbled, but she didn't stop. They rounded a corner, past locked doors, past nurses who gasped in shock, past bewildered patients who peered out of their rooms. Pastor Daniel's mind raced. They needed a way out. Then he saw it, an EXIT sign glowing red at the end of the hallway. His heart pounded, just a little further. He could hear the guards behind them, their shouts growing louder. Then, just as they reached the door, a hand grabbed his shoulder, face to face with the enemy. Pastor Daniel spun around and froze. Standing before him was Dr. Miriam Caldwell. She wasn't angry. She wasn't shouting. She was smiling. "You've made a mistake, Pastor," she said smoothly. "You're interfering with medical treatment. You have no idea what you're doing." Pastor Daniel met her gaze, unflinching. "She's not sick," he said through gritted teeth. "And you know it." Dr. Caldwell's smile didn't falter. "And who do you think they'll believe? A desperate pastor? A confused patient? Or me?" Pastor Daniel's stomach twisted. She wasn't afraid, because she thought she'd already won. His mind raced. Then he remembered. The documents in his coat. The proof. Slowly, Pastor Daniel reached into his pocket. Dr. Caldwell's smile faded. "What are you doing?" she demanded. Pastor Daniel pulled out the papers and held them up. Dr. Caldwell's eyes widened. Because in that moment, she knew. She wasn't in control anymore. Pastor Daniel took a step forward, his voice calm, but firm. "This ends now." Breaking the chains. The air inside Rosewood State Psychiatric Hospital was electric with tension. The wail of the security alarms pulsed through the hallways, setting the entire facility into chaos. Red warning lights flickered overhead, bathing everything in an eerie glow. And at the center of it all, Pastor Daniel stood face to face with Dr. Miriam Caldwell. In his hand, he held the documents that could end this nightmare. Dr. Caldwell's icy gaze flicked between the papers and the weak, trembling woman beside him. Teresa Winston. For the first time, Pastor Daniel saw something flicker in her expression. Not anger, not authority, but fear. She knew. She knew she was caught. "This ends now," Pastor Daniel said, his voice steady despite the pounding of his heart. Dr. Caldwell's lips parted slightly, her confidence cracking for the first time. But then, just as quickly, she recovered, schooling her face into something almost bored. "You have no idea what you're doing," she said smoothly, as if speaking to a child rather than a man holding proof of her wrongdoing. Pastor Daniel didn't flinch. "I know exactly what I'm doing." He lifted the documents. "This is fraud, Doctor. Gregory Winston had his wife committed illegally, and you let it happen." Dr. Caldwell's nostrils flared. "Pastor." "No," he cut her off. "You drugged an innocent woman. You kept her locked up when she was never sick. And you knew it." Her jaw clenched. Pastor Daniel took a step closer. "You thought no one would notice, that no one would come looking for her, that her faith, her daughter's faith, wouldn't be enough. But guess what?" His voice hardened. "We found her, and we're taking her home." The last stand. A shadow passed through Dr. Caldwell's eyes. For a split second, it looked like she might back down. Then, her face hardened again. "You're making a mistake," she said, her voice dangerously low. Pastor Daniel braced himself. "The only mistake was allowing people like you to operate unchecked for so long." Dr. Caldwell took a breath, as if considering her next move. And then, her eyes flicked to something behind him. Pastor Daniel's stomach dropped. A guard. Moving fast. He barely had time to react before the man lunged. A flash of movement. A heavy hand grabbing his shoulder. A sudden force shoving him backward. He stumbled, but didn't fall. Teresa let out a weak cry, clutching the doorframe to keep herself steady. The guard grabbed for her wrist. And that's when something inside Pastor Daniel snapped. He wasn't a fighter, but he was a protector. He swung his arm, slamming his elbow into the guard's midsection. The man grunted, stumbling back just long enough for Pastor Daniel to grab Teresa's hand and bolt. Run. They had to run. Down the hallway. Past locked doors. Past nurses who watched in shock. The EXIT sign burned red in the distance, calling them forward. Another guard appeared. Pastor Daniel's adrenaline surged. He spotted a rolling cart nearby. Grabbed it, shoved it hard into the approaching man's path. The guard tripped, cursing as he crashed to the floor. They were almost there. Almost free. Pastor Daniel slammed his shoulder into the emergency exit door. It burst open, spilling them into the cold night air. The first breath of freedom filled his lungs. But the moment was short-lived. A sharp, blaring alarm pierced through the darkness. A new threat. They weren't out yet. The parking lot showdown. They were outside. But so were the guards. Dr. Caldwell had called for backup. The sound of rushing footsteps filled the air, voices barking orders. Stop them. Pastor Daniel tightened his grip on Teresa's arm. But before he could move, a black SUV screeched into the lot. Headlights flashed. The passenger door flung open. Pay us door. Get in. It was David Reynolds, the caseworker. Pastor Daniel didn't hesitate. He helped Teresa into the backseat, climbing in after her. The moment the door slammed shut, David hit the gas, tires screeching as the SUV peeled away from the facility. Behind them, guards ran into the parking lot, shouting. But they were too late. Pastor Daniel turned, watching Rosewood disappear in the rearview mirror. They had made it. Teresa was free. The road to redemption. The drive back to St. Matthew's Church was silent at first. Teresa sat against the window, staring out at the passing trees as if she couldn't believe she was outside. Pastor Daniel stole a glance at her. She looked so fragile, so tired, but she was awake now. No more drugs, no more fog. For the first time in months, she was herself again, and she was going home. Then, a soft whisper broke the silence. Where is my daughter? Pastor Daniel's throat tightened. She's waiting for you, he said, his voice warm. She never gave up on you, Teresa. A single tear slipped down her cheek. Neither of them spoke after that. The only sound was the steady hum of the road beneath them. The reunion. By the time they arrived at the church, the sun was just beginning to rise. A soft golden light spilled over the horizon, bathing the church in a glow that felt almost holy. David pulled into the parking lot and shut off the engine. For a moment, no one moved. Then, the doors to the church flew open, and there she was, Tasha, her small frame silhouetted against the morning light, her wide eyes locked onto her mother. She didn't move at first, almost as if she didn't believe what she was seeing. Then, Teresa sobbed, and Tasha ran. She threw herself into her mother's arms, wrapping her small arms so tightly around Teresa's waist it was as if she was afraid to ever let go again. "Mama," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. Teresa clutched her daughter, shaking, her own sobs racking her fragile body. "My baby," she choked out. "My baby girl." Pastor Daniel stepped back, watching the scene unfold with misty eyes. Tasha had prayed for this moment, and God had answered. Epilogue. A town's awakening. News of what had happened at Rosewood spread like wildfire. The congregation, once divided and hesitant, now rallied together. They came forward, offering help, food, shelter. The church became more than just a place of worship. It became a sanctuary, a home for those in need. And at the center of it all, Tasha, the girl who had once knelt in the snow, praying alone. She wasn't alone anymore. Her faith had moved mountains, and it had changed everything. Final words. As Pastor Daniel stood at the altar one Sunday morning, he looked out at his congregation. Tasha sat in the front pew, her mother beside her, both smiling. And he realized something. This had never been about saving one child. It had been about saving all of them. Restoring faith, restoring love, restoring the community. Pastor Daniel smiled. "God works in mysterious ways," he said softly. And in the silence that followed, everyone believed it.